Thank you to Michael and Jill and Aruna for the invitation to speak, and thank you all for coming. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I feel very privileged already and also quite humbled by the introductions so far, which have been quite, I think, provocative and really amazing in mapping out the terrain and preparing for the questions that we're going to ask. So I feel like my contribution now is I feel it's a quite humble one. So I too wanted to address the title of the conference. When the invitation came, there was a pretty explicit suggestion that we take on, that we really adopt and take seriously this agonistic, this productive agonism and potential dissensus. And so I'd like to begin by questioning the title also of this idea of exploding art history. And I think it's, I don't know, it's for me, it's a potentially a dangerous term, even given Aruna's really interesting problematization of it in relationship to the acknowledgement of terror and terrorism. So I think before we turn into terrorist art historians and go up blowing up more Buddhas or anything like that, I think maybe I'd like to propose something else, which is why don't we think of occupying art history? So what would it mean to occupy art history? And here, let's see. Here, obviously, I've been quite moved and impressed and provoked by the recent political developments around the world, but beginning in North Africa and the Middle East and extending outward in ways that may be in solidarity and also quite important differences between the different geopolitical contexts. But in the place where I live, which is London, there have been important recent uprisings, and this is a scene recently from the Occupy the London Stock Exchange, which has taken up the premises in front of St. Paul's Cathedral. And here you see a group of the tents under the banner "Capitalism is Crisis," looked on ominously by a group of police whose repressive presence has been there all along. So what would it mean to occupy art history? That's what I'd like to ask and try to answer in a specific way. I'm interested in developing this provocative agonism, a potentially productive insolence or a questioning of authority in relationship to art historical discourses and knowledges and canons and institutions and modes of exhibition. So how can art history relate to it? How can it be moved by it? How can it be inspired by it? How can it potentially lose credibility as a result? How can it reinvent itself in the wake of that loss of potential credibility? This speaks to my increasing discomfort with art history's lack of what I perceive as a kind of a lack of interest in globalization, at least in a certain sense, in relationship to contemporary practices, as I'll explain as I go through my presentation. Particularly in terms of the history of post-colonial discourse. I feel like in many ways art history is behind and tends to study objects and produce monographs and stresses thematic concerns, focusing on how artworks create meaning, which it does obviously very well. And as far as I see it, it addresses contemporary globalization or the global within contemporary practice from four typical approaches. For one, it approaches globalization in terms of a subject of representation, in terms of things like non-spaces and post-industrial sites and migration and forms of bare life. A second way is through consideration of new mediums, for example, digitization and social networks, internet platforms, social and relational engagement, and archival impulses. I meant to put this on, which is a still from Steve McQueen's film Western Deep from 2002, which is an example of a rather incredible work of art that I've dealt with in my own work, again focusing on the object, on internal qualities of representation, of affect, even of the post-representational, of the migrant forms in relationship to an attempt to problematize globalization. A third way is to bring out the structures of globalization in terms of forms of spectacle, of nomadism, of hybridity, of intermingling of fact and fiction recently, new forms of participation. And lastly, the expanding areas of coverage in terms of developing art histories of Asian practices or Latin America or Africa, etc. So those are the five rather powerful ways that art history has developed an analysis of globalization in relationship to contemporary art. But what I find lacking here is, and my proposition is, a study of exhibitions as a site of globalization. We all know that exhibitions are key to globalization, especially the biennialization of the post-socialist 90s and the rapid growth of these mega international exhibitions across the globe ever since. But still, I feel that there's been little sustained art historical research around how globalization might be defined and negotiated and advanced and contested at such mega exhibitions. These questions, of course, have been addressed, but most commonly, in my view, via curatorial discourse, and sometimes in critical ways and very productively, other times in somewhat narcissistic ways. And there's a number of publications that we could point to that do this, such as the Biennial Decade or the various roundtables with curators, for example, in Art Forum and other magazines and journals, or the development of new series of exhibition histories. For example, After All Press in London has recently developed a series on exhibition histories, beginning with When Attitudes Become Form. And also there are journals, curatorial journals like Manifesta Journal, and the more recently inaugurated Exhibitionist Journal. So there's various sites where curatorial practice has begun to address the history of exhibitions and pose questions about how globalization relates to contemporary forms of exhibition. But how might there be a more sustained and critical approach of such exhibitions and their relation to globalization from the art historical, which would by necessity be a theoretically interdisciplinary approach, which could potentially explode or alternately occupy art history's conventional boundaries, even while allowing for the discipline's reinvention. For the exhibition is not, of course, simply an expanded work of art. It's not merely a system of representations or heterogeneous mediums or a series of diverse artistic structures. It's also an entirely different assemblage of these, as well as a complex multiplicity of processes and spaces with transnational agents and diverse funding bodies, institutions, corporations, patrons, curatorial positions and conceptualizations, catalogs and diverse publications, relations to cities and local politics, nomadic public spheres, with local, regional, and global discursive reach. So it's really, in terms of these large-scale exhibitions, they inhabit a potentially infinite variability. And certainly plural disciplinary competences are needed to analyze them. So I'm thinking just of several: art history, political theory, post-colonial theory, sociology, economics, cultural geography, museology, and so on. So simply by taking exhibitions as an object of study, it necessitates a form of interdisciplinarity. Of course, there's been important precedents in the study of exhibitions, and Aruna already mentioned some of the key ones, and I'm thinking specifically of Tony Bennett's notion of the exhibitionary complex, or James Clifford's critical anthropology of museum institutions, and the various studies of historical exhibitions and festivals and international expositions of the 19th century. But that said, there haven't really been the same kind of systematic and sustained and deep analyses of contemporary exhibitions. Maybe they've just been too recent in the last 10 years. So my interest is even still more specific, which is this: how do biennials and these kind of mega exhibitions, including documentos, how do they relate to a form of alter globalization, to an occupied globalization, to an occupied global art history? Let me give you 3 examples very quickly, because there's no way I can fit all this in a half an hour, but 3 examples to give you a sense of where I would like to go with this. Certainly a key exhibition in terms of opening up the possibilities and in a way that has been, I think, paradigm shifting has been Documenta 11, directed by Okwuenwezor in 2002, with its 5 so-called platforms. And these are, just to remind you, Platform 1, dedicated to the discussion of democracy unrealized, which took place in Vienna in 2001 in preparation for the final exhibition in 2002. These are just from the website, which has been archived online. Platform 2, which was dedicated to experiments with truth, transitional justice, and the processes of truth and reconciliation, which was in New Delhi. Platform 3, Creolite and Creolization in St. Lucia in the Caribbean. And Platform 4, Under Siege, 4 African cities in Freetown, Johannesburg, and Kinshasa, and Lagos, which took place in Lagos. And finally, Platform 5, which was the actual exhibition in Kassel in 2002. So for me, again, there's been a tendency in relationship to Documenta 11 to consider the artwork in the exhibition at length, but not so much the exhibition model itself as a new form, a new format of what, for example, Okwuenwezor, with a nod to Arjun Appadurai, calls the formation of a diasporic public sphere, where there's a sustained there's been, in other words, no sustained art historical analysis of this crucial exhibition as a form of expanded cultural production, as an interlinked and nomadic series of discursive events that can then bring together artistic practices and political discussions, post-colonial histories and neoliberalism, as a form where critical approaches to globalization takes place. Furthermore, so how would we begin to approach such an exhibition like this? And for me, I would like for me, it calls up a whole history of important precedents that I feel also have been under-acknowledged or underprivileged or even completely ignored in terms of the discussions of contemporary practice and in terms of the longer history that goes back into the 20th century. So in terms of the precedents for Documenta 11's very fascinating program, I'm thinking of a history of exhibitions that attempted to bring together artistic developments in the non-West, the so-called non-West, with political solidarity movements, such as the All African People's Conference in the late 50s and early 60s, which met in places like Accra and Tunis and Cairo. The first being organized by Kwame Nkrumah, which included figures like Patrice Lumumba and George Padmore, or the Tricontinental Conference in solidarity with the peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America that met in Havana in 1966, where Amilcar Cabral of Guinea spoke, and where you see Castro addressing the audience here. Or the Pan-African Festival in Algiers in 1969, which included the Black Panther leader Elridge Cleaver, which is an absolutely fascinating context where liberation movements and struggles for decolonization came together with politicizing cultural events and theater and other artistic forms. And finally, the World Festival of Black Arts, or Negro Arts, from 1966, meeting in Dakar. So these are rather, I think, amazing precedents that can potentially produce a very important historicization of the developments recently that have that we could address through this important legacy of struggles of the non-aligned movement and forms of solidarity between Asia, Latin America, and sub-Saharan Africa. For me, also, they represent, as I've indicated, really important the sites where we have this sense where a consideration of aesthetics and political engagements come together, so that when, for example, when Aruna talks about the significance of the ethical obligation of art historians and the political stakes of intellectual practice, this for me would just to turn our attention to models like this would be a way of realizing those kind of ethical obligations and political stakes. Another example is the project Utopia Station of 2003 onward. which was organized by the curator Hans-Ulrich Obrist and the art historian Molly Nesbitt and the artist Rikrit Tiravanija. It has comprised various manifestations since its inauguration in 2003, including a poster project with some 150 participants disseminated by eFlux, and various art exhibitions and educational seminars and social gatherings in multiple cities such as Paris, Venice, Frankfurt, Poughkeepsie, and Berlin. These nomadic activities function without hierarchy of importance, as for the curators, they say there's no desire to formalize the stations into an institution of any kind. With their presentations of Utopia Station at the 2003 Venice Biennale, which you see some images of here, they introduced the subject of utopia by referencing the well-known 1964 discussion between Frankfurt School philosophers Theodor Adorno and Ernst Bloch. Whereas for Adorno, utopian thinking means fundamentally to imagine the transformation of the totality, for which he had in mind social, political, and economic realities as an integrated system. For Bloch, utopia issued from the realization, as Brecht put it, that something's missing. And to answer that question, what is missing, they turned to various political thinkers and philosophers such as Etienne Balibar and Jacques Rancière and Emmanuel Wallerstein and Edouard Glissant. So here you see a discussion with Hans Ulrich, Molly Nesbitt, and the late Edouard Glissant at Venice. So the project amounted to a multiplicity, a gathering of endless possibilities, collaborative, transnational, and in a way, when the reference to imagine the impossible that Judith Butler spoke at the Occupy Wall Street recently in New York, I think that here we have a similar opening up within artistic territory of the utopian as a way to imagine the possible. Of course, it was also corporate sponsored. But it also included these radical thinkers, so it's a necessarily contradictory space of complexity and yes, antagonism that certainly needs to be brought out not only in the discursive theoretical realm, but also in the economic realm. And I think that's a crucial area of analysis that is, again, understudied within art historical circles, that is the politics of economy. But before we would want to dismiss the project because of this kind of corporate interventions and the obvious spectacle of the event that it exemplified, I want to turn your attention to what was maybe the most interesting aspect of Utopia Station as a project, or as the curators would want to say, a project of projects. Which is that it exited the cozy familiarity of the art world framework and joined the anti-capitalist left at the World Social Forum in Porto Alegre in 2005. As we know, the WSF has served over recent years as a platform for international members of civil society, including leading activists such as Arundhati Roy and Mustafa Barghouti and Shirin Ebadi and Gilberto Gil, and a multitude of environmentalists, human rights activists, labor organizers, and anti-war protesters, all allied in opposition to neoliberalism and in support of an equitable distribution of wealth, resources, and political participation worldwide. The 2005 meeting in Porto Alegre was unique in that the forum placed the role of culture in emancipatory politics on its agenda. So here we have again the possibility of linking it back to that history of the non-aligned movement, which is, I think, really, really interesting. So Utation joined this discussion in some ways that were productive, in some ways that were, I think, obviously limited. But they included, they developed a radio station program, they had video programs on local television, they had a presentation of the Utopia Station poster project on the city walls. So one term that I see that is particularly useful when it comes to analyzing objects like this that are necessarily multiplicities, that break down the barrier between the realm of artistic practice and the realm of like non-governmental politics, is this term transversality. With its origins in the work of Deleuze and Guattari, think of Guattari's three ecologies or chaosmosis. And it's been developed by several others recently, from people like the philosopher Gerald Raunig in Vienna. And I think it's a particularly useful term to get at one potential radical dimension of the alter global, which is to reject or to rethink disciplinary boundaries, to be out of place with determination, as Mi-Wan Kwan puts it, to participate in the definition of social, political, and economic world, and to really to take up roles and competencies that are not relegated to us within the hierarchies of institutions, as someone like Jacques Rancière would put it. Okay. A third and my last example of a very provocative example of an international exhibition that attempted to problematize the conditions of neoliberal globalization is the 2009 Istanbul Biennial, which was directed by the curators VHV, or What, How, and For Whom. And here you see a really interesting photograph of them performing their manifesto for the biennial in Istanbul. They are a Zagreb-based curatorial collective, and they, for this exhibition, they drew on Bertolt Brecht's belief in the utopian potential and the open political engagement of art as inspiration for the show. They asserted that if art's utopian political potential seems dated, historically irrelevant, then this is symptomatic of the fact that something has gone wrong with contemporary society, with the role of art within it. But here this something was specified, unlike in Utopia Station, where the curators very self-consciously did not want to pin that term down. For VHV, they referred to Brecht's devastating three-penny opera finale, What Keeps Mankind Alive, whose refrain answers the blunt question in the harshest of terms. What keeps mankind alive? The fact that millions are daily tortured, stifled, punished, silenced, oppressed. Against our dystopian present, then, the curators turned Brecht's call to politicize art into a rallying call in their effort to resituate aesthetics today in renewed solidarity with socialist modernity. And I think this is absolutely fascinating and important in the East European context. As they contended in their catalog essay, communism, with its basic values of social equality, solidarity, and social justice, remains unique as an emancipatory politics capable of challenging the global hegemony of neoliberalism, which, in an environment of increasing political authoritarianism and military domination, is leading, they claim, toward fascist tendencies. There's much to be said here, and it's, I don't want to paper over the potential problems with this position, but I think it's really fascinating to, and it's gaining momentum, it seems, in Europe. There's a lot of discursive events and conferences organized around the remaining potentiality of communism today. So in terms of the exhibition, VHV made selections that dramatized the erosion of liberal democracy and offered a political imagination that was inventive rather than doctrinaire, with inclusions such as Mohammed Osama's documentary film Step by Step from 1977, portraying nation-building in socialist Syria, and Uzbekistani artist Vyacheslav Akunov's reuse of socialist propaganda imagery in his cycle of collages Leninania, again from the late 70s, early 80s. And the Turkish artist Yüksel Arslan's allegorical paintings from his 1973 series called Capital. Just some quick images here you see. So such pieces oscillating between 1970s socialist realism and post-constructivist agitprop granted the show a sense of historical depth, operating like an archive of revolutionary practices that was regionally and historically focused, regionally in terms of Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. VHV also wanted to call on art to invent a socialist aesthetic in the contemporary period that would set pleasure free, as they said, so that society can regain the revolutionary role of enjoyment, suggesting an important attempt to join utopian imaginings to political desire and aesthetic affect. As exemplary in this case was the Moscow and St. Petersburg-based artistic and political collective Chateau Delat, or What Is to Be Done, who presented a series of videos documenting and reenacting the last days of Gorbachev's Soviet Union under perestroika. And in another of the installation's videos, Perestroika Songspiel, The Victory Over the Camp from 2008, which they showcased an allegory of the descent of post-communist Russia into the hands of greedy entrepreneurs as a wall text, and you can see some of this here. A wall text chronology of the post-'89 years juxtaposed the question, what has happened, with what might have happened. Nonetheless, critics took VHV to task for playing along with the Istanbul Biennial's institution and its corporate sponsors, particularly the industrial conglomerate Koç Holding, ostensibly rendering the curator's radical rhetoric hollow, if not hypocritical, pointing out that the biennial would run during Istanbul's hosting of the annual meeting of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and World Bank, yet was doing nothing about it. The activist collective Resistanbul, a formation of several leftist activist groups involved in planned protests, sarcastically asked the question, what does enthusiastically clapping after the speeches of the CEO of Koç Holding and the Minister of Culture mean, right after shouting out, every bourgeois is a criminal, as VHV quoted Brecht during the biennial's opening? What is it, if not a symptom of cynicism? It's in this sight, though, of radical political aesthetic presentation and its relationship to the global justice movement that I think needs a lot more analysis and rethinking, both from within curatorial practice and art historically. So these examples, even if their analysis is here drastically reduced, it does offer, I think, a glimpse of an outline of a different kind of art history, an occupied art history, according to which globalization is shown to be a complex matrix of representations and structures and mediums and institutions, where transversality is a key tool of analysis, such that interdisciplinarity produces ruptures within art history and its privileging of art, the artist, and draws on hybrid energies of visual culture, cultural studies, post-colonial theory to develop an analysis of exhibition histories. There's also an important political engagement. Art history takes seriously the movement toward new interrelations between aesthetics and politics and no longer privileges art's domain, but rather the wider field of visibility that considers distribution, exhibition, discursive production, that like much contemporary art has become integral to expanded forms of practice. And in some ways, this might seem reminiscent of the visual culture art history debates in the 1990s. But in my view, there's no longer such an opposition. The material is there, it's in the journals. The problem is often with the journals, the publishers, the departments and practitioners of art history that are increasingly entrenched within what I see as a rather conservative disciplinary position. But it's time to take seriously these research exhibitions as perhaps the most revealing site where the global can be rethought critically and creatively, and placed next to the growing critical project of the alternative to neoliberal globalization. So finally, what does it mean? What would it mean to occupy art history? It would mean, for me, to stand in solidarity with the Occupy movement, with the 99%, including opposition to corporate greed and economic inequality in the most general, basic way. It would mean to join students opposed to the privatization of universities, especially in the UK and in Europe, where publicly funded universities are under attack, and against the accepted form of student debt for life, opting instead for free universal education. I did a Google search for Occupy Art History before the conference, and I came up with one entry, which is from a student in the Midwest in the States who was lamenting the fact that students who study art history are often saddled with $200,000 of debt when they finish. I think we should join that student in protesting the system. It would mean also to ask how art history can be made relevant to the demands of the Occupy movement, including global justice, environmental sustainability, social and cultural inclusivity, and diversity. And by the way, I'm involved in a special issue of Third Text that will come out next year. And so I'm looking for, if anyone is doing any work on contemporary art and the politics of ecology, I would be interested in talking to you. It would also mean continuing the questioning of art history's canons of artists, its reaffirmation of North American and Eurocentric hegemony in terms of those canons, and also their theoretical references. And here I think I take Susan Buck-Morris's call for expanding our theoretical system of discursive canons very seriously. It would also mean to decolonize art history by challenging its disciplinary complacency with blockbuster exhibitions and conventional conferences and journals, this conference notwithstanding. How many more special issues on Andy Warhol can there be? How many more retrospectives on Gerhard Richter? How many more conferences on Robert Smithson? These are all great artists. There's nothing against those artists, but let's, we all need to work together to expand this territory. It would mean also transforming globalization into a set of political, ethical, aesthetic, theoretical problems and structures and processes that are relational rather than resting complacent with its definitions, so that globalization merely means global coverage and inclusivity, although that too is necessary, and that's already been addressed. And lastly, I think it would mean to overcome both a Western-centric art history and also the ghettoization and sometimes a self-ghettoization of area studies specializations and the subdisciplinary enclaves of post-colonial studies. Thank you.